Hello listeners, this talk is about building alternate institutions and hiding in plain sight. I had been meaning to make this talk for some time. It has been on my list of topics for quite some time. However, the Adam Goods affair, which is something I just discussed in the previous talk that I just recorded, is something that really brought this out to me because I live abroad normally. I'm an expatriate, and so I'm not often directly party to a lot of how the cathedral works and what happens in the West. I get snippets of it here and there, but I don't I don't encounter it on the ground, and I don't encounter it in real time usually. But watching that whole Adam Goods affair unfold every day all around me, since I'm back in Australia on vacation, really brought this to the fore for me. So that's why I'm making this talk right now. It could have been in response to any number of issues. The cathedral, the thing about the cathedral is that it always follows the same game plan. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it was the Confederate flag, whether it was gay marriage, any of these other issues. It follows the same game plan, and the Adam Goods affair was just, one more match, basically. But nevertheless, that's the thing that prompted this. So the cathedral is very powerful, and I believe that unless some very powerful people switch sides, or a lot of ordinary people really become aware of the cathedral, then I don't think the cathedral's about to lose power anytime soon. It will eventually, because it will be unsustainable, but I don't think it's going to lose power anytime soon. Firstly, I don't think people are going to switch sides, powerful people. Why would they? They're invested in the status quo or the system and how it operates now. And the average person is just not aware of things. They're too comfortable and they're too pacified by a whole lot of other issues. So I don't believe the cathedral is going to lose power anytime soon. So because of that, the cathedral is going to be able to continue to roll over the culture, just like a steamroller. It's just going to be able to roll over the culture and the institutions and so on of the West. And as I mentioned right at the end of that previous talk, if they see that we have nice things, or that we have our own spaces, or whatever they are, however you want to describe the culture, if they see that there's still some little corner somewhere that is holding out, then they're going to target that little corner, that institution, that part of the culture, and they're going to want those things. They're going to want those nice things, or that part of the culture. Sometimes it's because I want them because of the power or the resources involved, but basically just because they want them, because they can't have anyone who's different, they can't have any resistance, and also because they want to rub it in our faces. So anything that we have that's out in the open is going to be a target for them. And I think anyone who thinks that they're going to fight them on that they're going to fight a pitched battle with them, is probably going to lose, because they just don't have enough power, really, to fight the cathedral. The cathedral, when it really kicks into gear, across all of it, its multiple tentacles, is just this fearsome thing to behold. And I don't think that most people are firstly aware of how it operates, or secondly have enough power. And so you see these people, they try to make a stand sometimes, and they just get absolutely flattened by it. And that's the wrong way to go about things, I think. I don't think voice works within within a system that's dominated by the cathedral. Firstly, the rules of the game are really stacked. You'll see these people who will say, they're being irrational, they're being unreasonable, and they try to argue with them, they try to debate them, they try to be logical and appeal to decency, all of these things. And, it's just a waste of time, because the cathedral doesn't operate in good faith. It doesn't care about those things. It wants you to do those things because then it can make a sucker of you because it's not playing the game by the rules. It wants you to play by the rules, but it doesn't play the game by the rules. And you'll see these people complaining about that, but I mean that's the whole point. That's the whole point of how the cathedral operates, that the rules are stacked against you, or the rules are for suckers, and the cathedral can do what it wants. So, fighting them out in the open because, you're right, or you have truth on your side, or you're moral, or any of this stuff, that's a losing battle. Likewise, if you sort of agree and amplify, or if you sort of say you wear the label that they attach to, okay, you can sort of shock them a little bit, but at least at this point, you pretty much just paint a big target on yourself if you do that. If they say, oh, you're a racist, and you say, yeah, I'm a racist, I mean, there are going to be dire consequences for most people for saying that, or for admitting that, or owning that. And in that way, actually, I think a lot of people don't fully understand what the cathedral does when it engages in these regular exercises to push the envelope. They're not just trying to sort of move the Overton window. What they're actually trying to do is get a lot of people who don't understand how the game is played, who think that there are a set of rules, to basically out themselves. They want them to declare themselves to be thought criminals. Those people don't understand that that's what they're doing to themselves, but nevertheless that's what the cathedral wants them to do, because it obviously saves them a lot of time, energy and other resources if you just stick your own head above the parapet and allow it to get shot off, rather than if they have to lob a shell over the parapet at you. Again, if you take that approach, you're probably going to lose, at least as things stand right now. So that only leaves a few options in dealing with the cathedral. One of them is to exit out of place, so actually to physically leave. That could involve expatriation, or it could involve moving your money offshore or something like that. Now, that's not necessarily an option for everyone, and of course, or another example might be white flight, but eventually you run out of places to run to. You can't hide forever, and eventually the cathedral will catch up with you and you'll have to face them at some point. And again, they want you to try to fight them out in the open. That's not the way to succeed, though. I believe the way to succeed is to exit in place, ultimately. And the way to do that is by building alternate institutions. We need to basically say, we need to make it so that all of these institutions and the general culture, they're not things that we absolutely need or depend upon. And of course there'll be costs involved, but we need to make it so that we don't need these things, so that therefore we don't need to participate in them. Now, what am I talking about there? Well, basically, one way you could do this is that you could try to be obvious but inoffensive, a la various religious minorities. The other way is to be hidden. Now, in terms of the former, so trying to be sort of obvious but inoffensive, in the same way that some religious minorities are, so maybe the Amish or Orthodox Jews or the Mormons, Scientologists or something like that. Generally speaking, I think that's actually becoming increasingly difficult, and I think that's a losing proposition, actually. We're already seeing that. I mean, any religious minority that's white, should I say, I mean, because there are others that aren't, and they don't seem to get the same level of attention from the cathedral that basically white religious minorities do. But basically, the Mormons, Scientologists and so on, they're always under a lot of scrutiny from the public. And I think it's getting harder and harder for any sort of Western or white religious minority to be able to practice its religion as it really wants. And it's actually even happening to other groups. I saw a really interesting article online a couple of months ago about the Orthodox Jewish community in Australia and divorce law. And it was actually written by a Jew, and basically it was all about how Orthodox Judaism is really oppressive to women, rah, rah, rah. It's all the sort of the cathedral narrative being turned upon Judaism. It was really surprising to me, actually, that this was happening. But it's sort of like the cathedral eventually gets to a point where it just has to eat itself. And, even Jews aren't immune from it, despite being heavily involved in creating a lot of these problems, though not entirely. But, being heavily involved in the growth of the cathedral, it's now starting to turn upon them and to eat them even. But nevertheless, they're not the only group. So I tend to think that thinking that you'll just sort of go about your business and mind your own business is, in the long term, I think that's not going to work. And it will be interesting to see how that works itself out with groups like the Amish, for instance. But I don't think they're going to survive indefinitely, actually, with the cathedral, because eventually it wants to eat everything. Now, of course, we have other things currently, the internet, homeschooling, and so on, and there are differing levels of freedom of speech and so on in different nations. So in some ways you can still be in plain sight, and you don't even have to be inoffensive. In some ways you can actually be offensive. But we're seeing that they're slowly turning the thumbscrews on all of that. It really surprises me that homeschooling isn't under a lot more threat, because that's a real break in the narrative. I mean, that sort of disrupts the whole process of indoctrinating children. And the internet, of course, they're trying to clamp down on many things on the internet, and so-called internet trolls, which basically means anyone who's not on board with the cathedral narrative on a whole lot of different issues. And different nations already have so-called anti-hate speech laws. I think these things are going to be ramped up over coming years. I think they're really going to try to clamp down on this, because the internet and these other things such as homeschooling have just allowed people to have far too much freedom of speech or be able to engage in dangerous ideas, according to people in the cathedral. So we're seeing it at universities already, of course, but I think we're really going to see this get ramped up in the near future. And of course, many countries have been disarmed, many populaces have been disarmed, though again, it's interesting, 3D printing is something that throws a spanner in that operation. But nevertheless, people have been disarmed in terms of being able to physically defend themselves. And I think even in terms of what they say and think, that's going to come increasingly under threat also. And of course, various governments are also trying to actively break up cohesive communities, because first what they do is they try to sort of make it voluntary. They try to entice people to engage in degeneracy and so on, and break ranks. But that hasn't been entirely successful. So now they're physically trying to break up communities who resist along any sort of lines, whether it's ethnic lines or whether it's along religious lines or anything else. So, for instance, we've seen already over the past few years that they're really putting in place laws to force religious organisations to comply, mainstream religious organisations, and we'll see how much longer other religious organisations take until they have to suffer as well. And also with things like in America with Section 8, how they're basically going to send poor, essentially non-white people into middle class, which are essentially white, neighbourhoods, again, to break those up and break up the social cohesion, the trust and the functionality of those neighbourhoods and so on. So, the government is actively trying to break communities. So, it's not enough to say that you'll have a community out in the open and just everyone within that community will just sort of avoid this kind of thing. they're not going to have that option anymore. It will be forced upon them. So we need to respond to this, because they are essentially coming for us in different places in different ways. So I know, for instance, that some people are already trying to work on a kind of anti-university or sort of alternate histories and all of these kinds of all of this kind of academic work. And I know that there are other things that are coming up, online learning and so on, that are chipping away at the current academy. That said, I don't think it will be entirely effective, because one of the things about school and university in particular is that it's not really about education, it's about credentialism. And so as long as they can sort of deny you good jobs, or as long as people have a reason to keep using state-sponsored credentials as a means of discriminating people, or not in the sense of along racial lines or anything like that. As long as they use those credentials to choose who gets a job or who doesn't get a job, then it's still going to be necessary for people to obtain those credentials, and they're still going to have to jump through the cathedral hoops and so on. So, of course, this is part of it. We need to challenge the education system at all levels, but that in itself will not be sufficient, I believe. And I think that as real alternatives start to challenge the academy, I think we'll see them really push back. And I do actually think that there will be an attempt to really rein in homeschooling in particular, as well as all of these online credentials, because I think that the cathedral will recognise, or really recognise, those things as a big threat. Nevertheless, we still need to do those things. Another thing we need to start really thinking about doing, and this is a way of sort of hiding in plain sight, is that we need to be engaged in a lot more nepotism, extreme nepotism, in terms of who we employ and who we associate with generally, and any kind of trade and commerce. We need to engage in extreme nepotism, and it may not be the most profitable solution in the short term, but in the long term I believe it's very necessary. And of course, other groups of people already do this. Other ethnic groups, other religions already do this. They're very in-group focused. We have to do the same thing. Now, of course, the government will try to prevent us from doing so, but as best we can, we need to fly under the radar with these things as well. And I think this is something that people in the West really aren't up to speed with, because we have such open societies, and because we're so out-group focused a lot of the time. When other people come in and game the system by being focused on their in-group, we're at a real disadvantage. And the system is set up to, in theory, punish kind of in-group favoritism, though it only does so in particular instances. But nevertheless, we need to get a lot more savvy about playing that game. Now, another thing that I've come up with here, and I really, I'm taking this off something that was just mentioned briefly by Henry Dampier on one of his blog posts, and it's something I don't really know a massive amount about, because I don't have the technical knowledge. But I believe he said that we need to start thinking about putting together our own alternative to the standard social media platforms, if not the internet in general, because I believe he was getting at the point that he thinks that there are going to be big purges of anyone on the right on Twitter or Facebook or any of these other social networking platforms, but also generally on the internet. And I think that's coming. I agree with him on that. So I think, again, I don't have the technical ability or knowledge to really do anything about that, but it does seem as though it would be very good if someone could get onto that pretty soon, I think. I wouldn't be surprised if if we really see these purges within the next couple of years. And related to that, I actually read recently that some of the BRICS nations are Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and also South Africa, that they're trying to put together their own internet cables. They're running their own cables because they don't want the US essentially to have control of the internet, particularly in terms of spying on them and so on. I don't really know how effective that can or will be, but nevertheless, that's quite an interesting thing, that they're essentially trying to set up their own internet. I guess that's kind of analogous to many of the other things they're trying to do in terms of set up their own institutions as alternatives to things like the IMF, and they're trying to set up their own currency that will eventually knock the US dollar off its perch as well. So, they're doing all sorts of stuff there. So I guess it's analogous to that. Now, obviously, we're probably not going to have the capital to be able to do any of these things, but nevertheless, it would be interesting to piggyback onto them. Now, of course, that's not to say that Russia or China or any of these other countries are necessarily going to be our friends either, but if we can use them as well as possible, we could at least buy some breathing space, or we could spread the risk, so to speak. There's this concept of diversification in terms of financial assets. Well, if we were on various internet platforms, for instance, then we could diversify our risk in that regard as well. Because I do think that we're looking at censorship fairly soon in the West, heavy censorship. Now, some people might say that there's another possibility to either voice exit in place or exit out of place. Some people would say, well, why don't we try to capture the cathedral then, rather than going through all this work of building these fleeing or fighting a losing battle or building these alternate institutions and so on. Why don't we just try to capture the cathedral? I've heard this mentioned in neo-reaction before. I don't think it's a viable possibility, actually, for two reasons, basically. The first one is simply the sheer scope of it. I don't believe that would be possible. So, why is that? Well, firstly, you'd either have to get people to convert, or you'd have to eventually get their positions. Now, why would anyone convert? Why would anyone switch sides within the cathedral at the moment? In the future, I think they probably would. If things started to really fall apart, some of them would, because they'd see that and they'd hope to maintain their power within what was going to replace what currently existed. But I don't think anyone's really about to switch sides at the moment, a handful of people here or there, because they have a real vested interest. I mean, they have power and they have money and so on because of the status quo, so why would they want to rock the boat? So I don't think people are going to switch sides. Now, in terms of inserting our own people into the cathedral, this is something that would take quite a very large number of people, I believe, and it would take quite some time. And those people would also have to be highly intelligent and highly capable. They'd have to be extremely dedicated to perhaps pursuing a career that was of absolutely no interest to them other than for ideological reasons. Now, of course, this has happened before. This is how the cathedral sort of got its claws into everything by this process. But there are a lot of people who are really sort of ideologically invested in these kinds of things. I don't think that's really the case. I don't think neo-reaction is that big, at least not at the moment. And I can't really see us having the numbers and the right kinds of people to be able to capture enough of the cathedral. And this actually brings me to my second reason for thinking that this wouldn't work. And that's simply because the cathedral is really highly attuned to this sort of approach. Now, over time they might become complacent, but it's asymmetrical. They don't play by the rules. They don't think like we think. They're always thinking about power rather than truth. They're always thinking about how they can advance a narrative, how they can capture more power. And the reason that they're really attuned to entryism is because they're very good at entryism. It's sort of like, it takes one to know one kind of thing. And so I think that they're very aware of that. And indeed, a large part of how they have captured various institutions is that back in the past, when these institutions were different, the people who were running the institutions at that time let people from the cathedral in because they were being open-minded and tolerant and so on. Once people from the cathedral got in, they weren't open-minded or tolerant. They only let other people like themselves in. And so over time, they gradually replaced enough of the other people until they had control. And then that was it. The institution was locked down from that point. And I think they're really attuned to that way of doing things. They would smell an entryist a mile away. So I don't think that's going to work. I don't think it's going to be possible to capture the cathedral until things have really fallen apart considerably, and then we probably will see people switch sides, but I don't think that's on the cards in the near future. Too many people have too much to lose, essentially, and it would be impossible to just be an entryist, really, at least in large enough numbers or in powerful enough positions. So really, I do think we're going to have to build alternate institutions, essentially. And we need to do those very much under the radar. Everything we need to do needs to be under the radar. We need to start shoring up skills. We need to start shoring up resources and wealth and so on. But we can't make it obvious to anyone. We need to do it so that no one thinks we're a threat. We're hiding in plain sight. And we need to make ourselves, rather than think about conflict, what we need to do is simply make ourselves robust or resilient, if not anti-fragile in the sense that Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about. But certainly we need to basically just be flying below the radar and have all of our ducks in a row so that when things do deteriorate, we can just step into the breach, so to speak. We can just take over naturally without having to make a big conflict of it. Just be in a position that we can just do that naturally as things fall apart around us. I don't think we can get involved in fighting battles and so on along the way. Now, of course, there will be entryists and infiltrators. I'm sure there are already entryists and infiltrators all through the alt-right, not just neo-reaction, but the entire alt-right. I mean, that's just going to be how it is. I don't think there's anything we can necessarily do about those people. Obviously, we need to be as on guard as possible, but I think we just have to accept that that's a reality. But nevertheless, I do think it's really important that we start thinking about building these alternatives right now, because, as I said, this was all prompted by the Adam Goodes affair. It could have been prompted by any other thing that's happened this year and any other thing that's going to happen in the remainder of this year and next year and the year after and so on. There's a lot more of this to come. And as I said, if you have nice things, if you have a nice place, they're going to come along and say, thanks, we'll have that. You're not going to be able to resist them doing that to you. So you need to have it hidden from them, and often hidden in plain sight. So I hope this has been thought-provoking. Let me know what you think. Thanks for listening.